One. Hi, and welcome to this episode of Brainy Moms, brought to you today by Learning RX Brain Training Centers. I am your host, Dr. Amy Moore, joined by my co-host, Dr. Jody Jedlicka, and we are coming to you today from a very sunny but a little chilly Colorado Springs, Colorado. And joining us all the way from Brooklyn, New York, is our guest, Debbie Reber. Debbie is a parenting activist, best-selling author, keynote speaker, and founder of Tilt Parenting, a website, podcast, and resource for parents who are raising differently wired children. A regular contributor to Psychology Today and Attitude Magazine, Debbie's newest book is called Differently Wired, A Parent's Guide to Raising an Atypical Child with Confidence and Hope. In 2018, she spoke at TEDx Amsterdam, delivering a talk called Why the Future Will Be Differently Wired. After living abroad in the Netherlands for 5 years, Debbie, her husband, and her differently wired teen moved to Brooklyn in 2019. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, good morning, Debbie. I love how you call yourself a parenting activist. When I was listening to your podcast, that seemed like such an appropriate way to describe you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and why you decided to write the book Differently Wired and how you even came up with that term Differently Wired?
Yes. So I am, as you mentioned, the mom of a now 18-year-old kid, one child, and this was not my plan to do any of this, to write Differently Wired. I used to work as an author for books for young adults and teenagers, and I would speak to young women because I was a recovering teen myself and worked in kids TV before that. And so I was just kind of humming along when I realized that my parenting journey was going to be a little more intense or different than what I had expected. I don't know what I expected, but not what was unfolding before me, because I discovered that the child I was raising was neurodivergent, which at the time we discovered that we didn't know what that meant or what was really involved, but we just knew that things were going to be a little more challenging. And so, going through everything we went through over the years of trying to figure out a path for my child named Asher, figuring out a path for Asher, figuring out a school, multiple school situations, understanding how to support this kid and really support myself as a parent and a partner in going through this. I really wanted to figure out how to support other parents then in this journey, because it can be very isolating and very overwhelming. It can feel impossible at times to find the right resources and to just know how to navigate this. And so when I kind of I wouldn't say I got through it because I'm still in it, but when I really kind of learned more about this journey, I knew that I wanted to use my skills of sharing resources and information and writing and help other parents feel less alone in this journey. And that's why I ended up writing Differently Wired.
Mm-hmm. I love that you saw the need or the hole and you used the gifts that you had to be able to fill that need. Where did you come up with the word tilt?
Yeah, so there's a story which I can share with you. And first, I will say it's not an acronym. A lot of people think it is. And to that, I say, if you come up with something good that works with TILT, let me know. Maybe it can become an acronym. But you mentioned it when you read my bio that we had moved to the Netherlands. And when we did that, it was in 2013. And we just threw all the rules out the window. We decided to radically change our lives. I became a homeschool parent. Wasn't my plan either, but that's what happened. And it was this really interesting time. And the summer before we moved, we went to the Jersey Shore and we were riding. Asher and I went on the Tilt-A-Whirl. If you know that ride, you kind of hold on and it whips you around. Mm-hmm. Unexpectedly. You never know when the next one's going to come. And so my husband took a picture of Asher and I on the Tilt-A-Whirl and caught us kind of mid whip. And we have these big smiles on our faces and our hair is blowing back and we're just holding on for dear life, but we're excited, but nervous. And it really captured to me the big changes we were making in our world. And so when we moved abroad, I started a blog called Tilt a World, where I started sharing what we were doing and what I was learning. And so then a few years later, when I started realizing I wanted to create a community and a resource for parents, I had pages of brainstorms for names of this, and I would run them by Asher, and Asher would say no to most of them because it was like, well, that has a negative connotation and this sounds like this, and this is, and a friend said, what about that word tilt? It really captures so much about what you're trying to do, which is reframe things, tilt the conversation. We all need to kind of approach neurodivergence and what's happening with our kids through this different lens. And as soon as she said it, I was like, that's the word. And then Asher approved. So I moved forward with that.
Yeah, I think when I saw that you label your chapter in the second half of your book, you label your chapters tilt number 1, tilt number 17, right? And so to me, it just said, hey, paradigm shift, number 1, like new way of thinking, number 2, right? Or new way of doing. I mean, you tilt your parenting perspective and your parenting practices. And you actually, you had a quote in your book that made me cry. You said, people apologize for things they've done wrong, things they regret. My son apologized for who he is. And I have 3 neurodiverse kids, and so completely related to that. And just knowing the struggles that they had in school and with teachers not understanding. And so I love the idea that your response to that is, hey, we have to think about a different way of parenting. Rather than trying to change our child, we need to look at this whole parenting process differently, right?
Yeah. Yes. And that was based on a story that I share of my child apologizing and just realizing that he was doing it all the time. And when I realized that was a conditioned response really to what had been happening in school, it did break my heart. And that when I wrote that book, even was now 7 years ago, I'm excited to see that I feel like the shift is happening. Maybe it's just who I hang out with, because I spent all my time talking to people who are in this, but I do feel like there is an increasing awareness of the fact that being differently wired is a difference. It's not a deficit, and that everyone benefits when we, instead of trying to get these kids to be compliant or to better fit in, that we really lean into their strengths and help them kind of learn on their terms and feel good about themselves. Because the toll that it takes on these kids to get the message every day that there's something wrong with them, or they're doing it wrong, or they're broken, or they're bad, they're the bad kids, that can last a lifetime. I mean, it's really heartbreaking when you think about how many kids are growing up with this internalized sense that I'm a screw up, or I'm not smart.
Yeah. So I want to dig in a little bit about some of these tilts for our listeners. But before we do that, can you talk a little bit about this idea of getting into that compare and despair cycle and what that means?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of us raising these kids live in that cycle, I think, especially around graduation time or, any kind of milestones, because I think we as parents of these kids, our experience is often different from what we expected. And it's different from what we may see, happening around us in our community, or with other parents, or with other family members who are raising their own kids. And so we can often get the reminder that this looks different, this is harder, this is more intense, or your child is not going to have this experience, or all of these things, because we have this picture in our mind about what our kids' life is going to be like, what our experience as a parent's going to feel and look like. And then we see what's happening around us, and it can be really hard to not hold our experience up to those standards, and then to feel like we really drew the short straw. And I mentioned graduation because that is one of those times where, we start seeing on social media the pictures of, so and so just performed at this recital, or just won this award in the class for being the most respectful student, or being, all of this stuff. And then we've got these kids who are incredible and are such sensitive, lovely, complicated, fascinating people who aren't going to win those awards. And we may not get a picture of them. They may have had such a negative experience at school that they don't even want to go to an event. They may be disinvited from events. And so that compare and despair cycle of looking at these things and keeping ourselves stuck in that feeling like, I wish this was our life, but this is our life. And the tension between those, can be really painful. And it's pain that we're really keeping ourselves in if we're kind of mired in that cycle, because we're continually focusing on what we don't have, as opposed to leaning into the awesome human that we're raising and kind of redefining what success and joy looks like for ourselves.
And so where do parents start? How do they start breaking that cycle?
Well, I think noticing it is the first thing. And that's kind of a theme throughout my book. So much of this is kind of doing our own deep inner work to start paying attention to the things that trigger us, the times we feel sad or frustrated or overwhelmed, or, that default thought of, this is always going to be hard, or we're using language like, my child will never, X, whatever that is. So we need to disrupt that. We need to catch ourselves saying those words, thinking those thoughts, feeling those feelings, and not that they're not valid. Like, I'm a fan of experiencing the feeling and trying to dig deeper and understand what's really going on. Because usually it's underneath that is this concern about our kids not being happy, which is what we want. We want our kids to grow up to be happy, fulfilled humans who can contribute to the world and feel good about themselves. So I think we need to kind of uncover what's really going on, and then start to just do our own work to reframe and to look for the bright spots in our own family, and to realize that social media, whatever we're seeing, that's not real either. What we're kind of imagining everyone else's life is like is not actually what their life is like. And we really want to just go into our family. Like, where do we find joy? What works for us? What are our strengths? How do we have fun? What does success look and feel like for us? And how can we do this on our own terms? And the more we can kind of stay in that space, then what other people are doing, it's not going to impact us as much.
Debbie, in your book, you talk a lot about education, and I think that's such a huge part of kids' lives and parents' lives. And my husband and I have both worked in education. And I often say that kids with challenges develop what I call school PTSD. It's just, these experiences that they've had that frame how they think and look at themselves. And so, can you talk about some of the limitations of various types of schooling, public, charter, private, for differently wired children, and some of the discoveries that you've made surrounding those different choices?
Yeah, I mean, education is, I think, the biggest challenge when our kids are younger, because that's really one of their primary jobs, right? Is to play and learn. And so often for us, those of us raising these kids, it isn't like, let's go to the neighborhood school and they're good to go for the next 12 years. It doesn't often look that way. I think there are challenges and potentially, pluses, and really every type of school. I think for public school, which is where most of these kids end up, if they have a formal diagnosis, then the possibility of them getting an IEP or having a 504 plan can work. It depends on the school district. I think the challenges of the public school system is the limitations with how mastery and knowledge has to be demonstrated, or there's so many tests that have to be taken and standardized tests, and you have to check all of these boxes, and a lot of these kids learn differently, and they may have a very different way of demonstrating knowledge, and there isn't much wiggle room in a public school system. I think there's more than we sometimes think, because sometimes the school will say, nope, can't do that, and then we accept that. And I think there's more room to push, and some school districts are more open than others. But a lot of it comes down to having a teacher who really sees that kid. And a good teacher can make all the difference, as you know, and a good IEP plan. But even IEPs tend to be so focused on a behavior, as opposed to the underlying stressors that are causing the behavior, or that those behaviors are coping strategies for. So I think public school can work, but it can be really tricky. Also the size of the classrooms, and for a lot of these kids, sensory issues are a big deal, and so bigger classrooms can be overwhelming. And then private schools can work great. It really depends on the school. I think the challenge with kind of a more mainstream private school, and by that I mean one that isn't specialized for learning disabilities and things, I think they don't have to provide any supports if they don't want to. And so that can be really challenging. Living in the Netherlands, the most expats send their kids to an international school, and so I looked at them and they were like, no, we can't do that. We can't support ADHD. We don't have the resources. And that's the same in a lot of places that and legally they can say no. So I think parents can feel like they have less of a voice in a public school. And if it works, it can work great. And if it doesn't work, it can be ugly. As I write about in my book, we had some pretty gnarly breakups with some schools in early elementary. And a lot of then, what's happening now, there are a lot of micro schools cropping up, which is really exciting to see. A lot more specialized schools for kids who are twice exceptional or have other learning differences. And those can be really expensive. So that can be really tricky and a barrier for so many families. And then a lot of families end up homeschooling, which is also not an option for everyone. It worked really, really well for us. What I find is that a lot of families with these neurodivergent kids, a majority of them will spend at least some time homeschooling, even if it's like an emergency situation or a school refusal situation. And so they pivot to homeschooling to get through a season or a certain phase, and then they try to find a better fit. So I think homeschooling can be a great option if it's available to you, because then we're not like focused on these arbitrary guidelines or approaches that have nothing to do with the way our kid learns. We can really tailor an educational experience that is rooted in their strengths, and that can be a really great gift, especially as you mentioned PTSD, to get these kids out of that cycle. It can take a while actually to detox from a negative school experience, months or years even.
So what is your advice? I think one of your tilts is to make a ruckus when you need to. And so talk about that in terms of your advice to parents who have no other option but to go to public school, right? They're dual working families, or they don't have the resources to pay for a private program, and they can't homeschool. Apply that tilt to how they can be advocates for their children in public school.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot more, as I said, that we can do that we don't know is available to us. We often are relying on other people to tell us what to do. We're not all experts in IEP. I mean, even the word IEP like makes my brain hurt. my kid has had IEPs. I've been to IEP meetings, and I still would not consider myself an expert in that at all. And I get really overwhelmed when I have to go to those meetings. And so I think kind of finding people who understand that system really well, working with an educational advocate, someone who can kind of be there, can be really supportive, because there actually is a lot that we can push for in terms of the types of accommodations our kid might have. A school will often, there's like a boilerplate accommodations. Oh, you've got this diagnosis, we'll give you this, this, and this. And oftentimes parents will just say, okay, I don't know what that stuff means. Sounds good. I'll sign it. And then we assume that it's all happening. And so I think realizing that actually if we can get in the weeds and we can say, this accommodation isn't going to work because of this. This is what we propose. Like, we can negotiate. A friend of mine talks about this, like buying a used car, like it's a negotiation. We both want to get what we want out of it, and we don't have to take no for an answer. So I think working with someone, and actually understood.org is a great resource in terms of finding ideas for what you can ask for in an IEP. But there is often more we can push for. We also need to know that we can ask for IEP meetings at any time. Like, so if we realize the teacher isn't enforcing an IEP, or actually it says they're going to do this, but none of this is happening, we can ask for another meeting, and we can go in and say, we need to make some changes. And so knowing that it's more of a living, breathing document, and that we can continue to advocate. I think a lot of parents are worried about being that parent, right? We want to be liked. We don't want people to be like, oh God, there's that mom again, like walking down the hallway. And then we're also getting often phone calls, right? Or emails for early pickup. And we're the ones who get calls from the principal or whatever, because of what happened on the playground. And so we can lose some of our power in that because we feel embarrassed or judged, and we can internalize that. And so I think we want to like kind of reframe that to be a good advocate and know, listen, what matters is this kid's experience. What matters is that my child feels successful in school. I know that's what you want as a school. That's what I want as a parent. And that's what this child deserves. So how are we going to make that happen? And so really working to build an alignment with the educators involved. And then just knowing this is going to be something we're going to keep tweaking together. It's not a once and done kind of thing.
Yeah, what I found was when I would negotiate those IEPs and the 504s for my kids, was that the teachers actually appreciated suggestions, right? Because they sometimes feel like, well, we've tried A, B, and C, and it hasn't helped. And so for the parent to come to the table and say, well, this has worked for me at home. What if you tried this, in the classroom? I got less pushback on that than I expected. And then I also found that if I leveraged the relationship with the pediatrician, my child's pediatrician, or whoever diagnosed my, different children, and said, hey, I drafted an accommodations letter. Would you put this on your letterhead, right? Save your pediatrician the work. They're typically more than happy to say, hey, here's our recommendation. And then you kind of have a little bit of, some credibility behind your suggestion too.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you're just getting creative. And I think, again, it requires us, because some of us, maybe a lot of us, are non-confrontational people. And so for us, we're worried that we're going to be perceived as antagonistic. And we also want to trust, or defer to the wisdom of people that we perceive to be more educated about this than we are, but that's not always the case. And so, I love that your child's teacher was open to that. I've had mixed experiences. I've had teachers love that, and I've had teachers been like, I know what I'm doing. Thank you very much. So I think it really depends.
Absolutely.
Weirdly, I've been on both sides of the table of an
Yeah.
IEP too. And I think sometimes the staff of the school wants to be non-confrontational as well. And so I think that also can be frustrating for parents because they know something needs to be done, and they're happy that you see all the good things, but they want to know what are we going to do to move forward with this. And so I think it makes parents feel validated when everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, 100%.
So talk a little bit about how parents can react to other people shoving their opinions at you about, well, what your child should be doing right now, or developmentally, how come your child isn't doing this right now? Give our listeners some advice on how they can respond to those suggestions from others.
Well-meaning, often suggestions, but very misguided. Yeah, I mean, there's no like easy answer in terms of how to do this, because I think a lot of us do get triggered by that, because again, it feels personal. It feels like this person is judging, and they may very well be judging how good of a parent we are, and we all want to feel like we're doing a really good job. And so I think if it is something that you get triggered by, then that's worth separately, before we get to the tactical things, kind of working on that piece. Like, why is this upsetting to me? What am I making it mean that this person has given me advice or has insinuated that I don't know what I'm doing? Like, and just kind of uncover that, what's going on. Often, again, like I feel like so much of our stuff is triggered from our own baggage that we grew up with, of feeling like we're not good enough or we're not smart enough. And so it's worth taking the time to be like, oh yeah, that's why this is really bothering me. Just so we can make peace with that in some way. And then I think it can be really helpful to just have some scripts at the ready for those types of situations, when someone gives you unwanted advice or asks you a question. I write extensively in the book about, I love the Dutch. I'm just going to say this, Dutch people are some of my favorite people on the planet, and they're super direct, which I'm good with. Like, I live in New York, I can deal with directness, but there was a lot of like, why are you homeschooling? We don't believe in homeschooling. It's bad for kids. And people would just say that to me point blank. And so I would instantly get defensive and feel like I had to explain. And then I realized I don't need to explain. Like, this is triggering for someone else because it's confronting their picture of what they think things should look like. It has nothing to do with me. So just kind of, if you find that you're getting, messages like more than once, and you're like, oh, this is going to come up again, I think it'd be really helpful to just write down, like, here are my like canned responses for all of these situations, just so that we're not in that situation where we have that deer in headlight moment where someone says something and then we get triggered and then we respond in a way that makes us feel bad later because we overshared, or we gave power to someone that took away some of our own, or we disciplined our kids in a public situation to make somebody else feel better when it was the completely wrong thing to do for our child. So I think if we can proactively plan for those scenarios, then they're not going to trip us up as much. And then we'll start to feel more empowered and confident, and it won't rattle us as much when people do that.
Can you share some examples that you added in the book of how you would respond, or how you did respond?
I don't remember what I wrote in the book, but I will say that I some things are like, oh, this is a really good fit for our family right now. And that's a complete sentence. Like, that's it. Like, I don't need to go on more than that. Or like, or sometimes it's like, wow, your kid is too old to be doing this. It's like, oh, this is a really hard situation for my child right now, but we've got it. Thanks for your concern. Just like very kind of, it doesn't have to be mean, but, or, a lot of our kids are asynchronous developers, right? So they may operating at a emotionally lower age, than their biological age, but meanwhile cognitively, they might be doing something that like a college student is doing. And so I think that's another one people sometimes get confused. It's like, oh, we're focusing on other things right now. Like this isn't a priority for us right now. We're really going all in on art because that's what we're doing. Again, complete thought, full sentence, period. We don't need to over explain. That can feel really uncomfortable for a lot of us. Because I mean, think about when we're making an excuse for saying no to something we've been invited to. Like we feel like we have to make it, give them a reason and explain all the things. And actually we can just say, oh, I can't make it. Thanks for asking. Like that's it. So it's kind of retraining us to have some healthy boundaries and just realize that other people don't need to be in our business.
I love that. Yeah, I used to say to my own mom, who would give me parenting advice, that's a really great suggestion. I'll think about that.
Yeah.
And so there's not a way to argue with that comment, right? Like it's like you're saying, it's a full sentence, it's a full thought, and it kind of shuts down the conversation there. I mean, there isn't much else to argue about.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like, oh, I'm so glad that works for you. Right? Like, oh, I'm so glad that book was like the answer to your whatever. Period. Yeah.
One of the things that you talked a lot about, Debbie, I don't know if it was all in the book or if it was on one of the podcast episodes that I listened to, was how parents can be kind of their child's safe space so that you almost using your own energy to calm them and keep them calm. And I really loved that. I don't know what my question is in that, but if you could talk a little bit about that,
Yeah.
just being able to calm them in those situations where things get out of hand.
Well, yes, I did write about that in the book. There's a tilt about, our own energy. I don't remember what the chapter is called, but it's this idea that we can use our energy for good or for bad when we're with our kids. And I wrote about a time that I realized in a really profound, like light switch kind of a way, how the way that I responded to an incredibly dysregulated little kid from a place of calm and groundedness, like it ended what was happening immediately. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is a superpower. Like all I have to do is stay like this for the rest of my life and we're good to go. Like no more regressions, no more meltdowns. Of course, that wasn't possible. It's not possible for any human to do that. But I really started to get curious about the way that my energy and the way that I was and responded to Asher when Ash was dysregulated could really make or break any situation. Of course, Dr. Dan Siegel talks about this and Tina Payne Bryson in their book, The Whole Brain Child and Mirror Neurons and what's really happening in the way our brains are communicating. And now, in recent years, there's been so much conversation about co-regulation and, Dr. Mona Delahooke talks a lot about this in her amazing books. And Tina Payne Bryson does as well. Like, anyway, I feel like what I thought was like, wow, I've just discovered something amazing. It's like, actually, this is neuroscience, Debbie, and it is so powerful what we can do to the way our nervous system talks to another human's nervous system. And it is my daily work right now. Like it has been this whole time, but now raising, having a teenager, it's all about me figuring out how can I co-regulate, because what I've learned, I just interviewed Dana for my podcast. She is kind of a translator of polyvagal theory, that we are always co-regulating with everyone around us. Like it's just what we don't even know we're doing it. And so it's an incredible thing to think about. And so knowing that we can really support a person who's dysregulated by staying regulated ourselves is such a worthy endeavor to try to do. It's not easy to do because we get triggered when our kids are like venting at us, or we're the recipient of all of their stuff. It can be really hard, but to work to get back to that place is really important.
Yeah, I feel like that's such an important tool to have in your toolbox because it doesn't say that their reaction is good or bad or anything.
Mhm.
It's just,
Mhm.
this is what I can do in this situation. So,
Yeah. So
Yeah.
powerful.
And that tilt is called recognize how your energy affects your child.
Yes.
Yeah.
AKA co-regulation. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I've heard that described as having one foot in and one foot out. So you have one
Mhm.
foot into their space, right? But while anchoring yourself
Mhm.
with your emotions in your
Mhm.
space,
Yeah.
so that you're not fully in theirs, right? Because then their energy is
Yes.
going to impact you and trigger you, like you're saying.
Yes.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I use the metaphor always of like, I'm really good at jumping in the pool with my kid. And so I'm really trying to stay on the deck and not go into the pool, but I'm there in case I need to throw a ring. Or as someone else just shared this metaphor with me of like your kid can be up in a tree like waving their arms and having a freak out, and you're just stay on the ground, like you're there, but you don't want to get up in the tree with your kid. You want to stay solidly on the ground.
Yeah. I like those metaphors. You could keep your legs dangling in the water while you sit on the edge of the pool.
Yeah, sure. Have
Absolutely.
a margarita or something. Yeah.
Right.
now we're talking.
All right. So we need to take a break and let Dr. Jody read a word from our sponsor. And when we come back, Debbie, we want you to tell us a little bit about your podcast and your club and how listeners can engage with you when we come back.
Are you concerned about your child's reading or spelling performance? Are you worried about your child's reading curriculum isn't enough? Well, most learning struggles aren't the results of poor curriculum or instruction. They're typically caused by having cognitive skills that need to be strengthened. Skills like auditory processing, memory, and processing speed. Learning RX one-on-one brain training programs are designed to target and strengthen the skills that we rely on for reading, spelling, writing, and learning. Learning RX can help you identify which skills may be keeping your child from performing their best. In fact, we've worked with more than 100,000 children and adults who wanted to think and perform better. They'd like to help you get your child on the path to a brighter and more confident future. Give Learning RX a call at 866-BRAIN-01 or visit learningrx.com. That's learningrx.com.
Okay, and we're back talking with author Debbie Reber. So Debbie, talk to us about your podcast, and you have a club, and just share those resources with our listeners.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So Tilt Parenting, which I'm coming up on 7 years, I'm just going to say, which is crazy pants to me, but it started as a podcast, and that's still kind of my key way of sharing resources. I've got more than 300 episodes, and I will just say, if you go back in the archives, I used to do conversations with Asher when Ash was 11 and 12, and we'd have these great conversations about what does it feel like to be distracted? What does it feel like when you're frustrated? So those are really fun episodes, but just conversations with authors, parents, thought leaders, and on anything having to do with neurodivergence. So I love my little podcast, and it's also Tilt has kind of evolved into a community. So we have a pretty active Facebook group called Tilt Together, and that I started 3 years ago, the Differently Wired Club, which is my way to kind of get in the weeds with parents. And we have a lot of office hour calls. We read a book together every month and have the author come in and talk with us, and it's just a really supportive community of parents who are in it and who get it. And again, including me, I always create what I need, and I still need the club. So I love the Differently Wired Club. And then I just want to share for listeners too, I have some really good free resources on there. I have something called the Differently Wired 7-Day Challenge, which every day is a little video that includes a tilt, a reframes that you can just play with. It's a little tweak that you can make in your life to see how you might be able to shift things in a way that feels better for you and your family. I have a new series I just put up that's also free. It's called 10 Things You Need to Know About Raising a Differently Wired Kid. And it's basically, if I could go back and tell myself, here's what you need to know. These are those things. And sometimes I wish I could have a do-over, but that's not going to happen. And then I have a roadmap for parenting a differently wired kid as well, which is an interactive PDF with a ton of resources for how to kind of move through this journey. It's not a linear journey, as you guys know, but there are kind of different phases that we find ourselves in repeat as we go through this parenting. So all of those are also at tiltparenting.com.
Fantastic. So listeners, Debbie's book, like I had mentioned in the very beginning, has 18 different chapters that talk about suggestions for reframing how you parent, from connecting with others to being on the same page with your spouse, to ensuring that you take time for self-care, to being an advocate for your child, and those interactions and how we interact with our child. Just full of great tips and exercises that I wish I had read 20 years ago when I started parenting diverse kids. So we do encourage you to take a look at her book and her resources. Debbie, is there anything that you haven't gotten to say to our listeners that you would like to leave us with today?
Yeah, I've got a few things actually. No, I will say one is that I always like to just remind people that our kids are not broken. And I think, especially if you're newer to this journey of realizing that this path is a different path than I expected, or, oh no, we've just found this out, this is happening and we've got to do, we kind of get into panic mode, and just kind of take a pause and take a breath and say, you know what? This is okay. Like, we don't need to fix anybody here. We need to figure out how to support this human on their unique journey. And we're all unique. And so I'm kind of leaning into that and getting out of that kind of panic fix it mode would be important. And I don't remember the other thing I was going to say, but it was going to be good, but we'll just stick with the, get out of fix it mode.
I think the community that you offer on so many different levels for people is just unbelievably valuable. So I know of at least a couple who are going to get an email from me saying, you really need to listen to this. It's awesome. So
oh, that's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I did think of what I wanted to say. Do you want me to say it?
Absolutely.
Before it leaves my brain again. I just want to say that one of the tilts in there is about respecting your child's unique timeline. And that, to me, I feel like now, especially in these quote unquote post-COVID days, and there's so much we're learning about our kids' development, or maybe learning, loss or whatever's going on. And I really want to encourage people to, if you find yourself getting panicked and stressed about, your child being behind, to just, again, take a deep breath and realize, like, every child is on their own unique timeline. Every child has their unique strengths and they're ahead, and other areas where they may be lagging, but we don't have to figure it all out right now. Like, really lean into the strengths that your child has and really focus on supporting them and feeling good about themselves and knowing about who they are. And don't stress about that compare and despair cycle. Don't think all these things have to happen this way, ABC. They don't. Like, we get to figure out the right path for our families and our kids. There is no one way that this has to look. So if you're feeling stressed about that, I'm just going to encourage you to take a breath and be like, it's going to be okay. We can do this on our own terms.
I love that. And I'm going to say something a little controversial here, but in response to the panic that I've been seeing over the learning loss during COVID, everyone is behind. So yes, schools really struggled to help kids make a year's progress in a year's time during the lockdown, but everyone was in that same boat. So compared to whom, far behind are your children actually falling, right? Like the entire country is in the same situation. And so we can all just commiserate about that, right? And we can all say, all right, it happened. Let's do the work we need to do. So don't panic. All right. Well, we are out of time and need to wrap up. So this has been a fantastic conversation today. Thank you so much, Debbie, for being with us. Listeners, if you would like more information about Debbie's work, her website is tiltparenting.com. You can find her on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Tilt Parenting. We'll put all those links and her handles in the show notes, including how to purchase her book as well. So thank you so much for listening today. If you liked our show, we would love it if you would leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on every social media platform at The Brainy Moms. You can go to brainymoms.co if you want to visit our website. So look, until next time, we know that you're busy moms and we're busy moms, so we're out.
Have a great week, everybody.